Fairmont Crest woke under a thick mist like fine dust settling over unsigned contracts and unswallowed vows, and at the center of that haze Martin understood that a fracture had taken root in the foundations of the family he once believed to be an architecture under his absolute control. The truth did not strike like lightning, it seeped through the grain like water, beginning with a prenatal appointment buried among expense papers, a clinic invoice filed in the wrong drawer, a test result carelessly left in the pocket of an old coat. Shards that meant nothing on their own suddenly soldered into a dark map of betrayal when placed side by side, and Martin, the man who prided himself on spotting risk before it had a name, realized he had arrived latest to the party in his own story. His fury did not blaze like a bonfire, it was a smokestack, venting the dense black exhaust of humiliation, helplessness, and a need for punishment refined into discipline. Because for Martin, anger is not merely emotion, it is an operational plan, a frame of reference for tightening order, an instrument reminding everyone that the power in this house still flows through a single valve. He looked at the living room the way one studies a strategic sand table, every family photo on the wall a unit to be redeployed, every chair a possible seat from which to read a sentence, every door an entry to a corridor leading to isolation. Samantha is no innocent, and she is not foolish. She is a survivor in an ecosystem that forces women to walk a tightrope stretched between ambition and sacrifice. The pregnancy did not come as an accident but as a mixed consequence of a hunger to be seen, the need to be loved without conditions, and a chain of choices made in hours when one imagines oneself strongest. Nathan did not enter her life like an aesthetic breeze. He arrived as an invitation to step out of the glass cage where Samantha had learned to smile at the correct angle, speak in measured lines, and stand precisely where the camera required. Nathan gave her a look unwrapped in protocol, a space where she was not an accessory to a brand or a shadow cast by Martin's authority. But Samantha erred in believing love could fill the hole carved out by power. The life growing inside her was proof of a desperate jailbreak, and that life, when it touched reality, became a naked flag hanging at midfield, exposing the ligature of every calculation. She knew what Martin would see in all this, the collapse of order, a slackening of discipline, the exposure of a breach he would never accept as real. She also knew she had no alliance strong enough to hold her up, because umbrellas in Fairmont Crest are raised for benefit, not compassion, and people yank their hands back the moment the first drop smells like a war beyond their budget. His decision to throw her out was not a spasm, it was a plan. Martin didn't kick any door open. He arranged staff, a driver, a timetable, witnesses, even the well-timed silence of people who would walk past the hallway. He knew how to turn a private decision into a public lesson, how to make each person in this house understand that certain boundaries cannot be trespassed without a price, and how to make outsiders draw conclusions that served his need for control. Yet even as he perfected the expulsion into a cold ritual, Martin could not shake the sense that someone had just placed a glass sphere beneath his feet. The fragility did not come from Samantha, it came from his own overconfidence, a long-held faith that the same toolkit that wins negotiations can manage private life. Some things cannot be tallied in money, cannot be bent with fear, cannot be trimmed by decree, they cling to the softest parts of a person, places powerful men seldom dare to look. Martin's loathing for Nathan had the structure of a drawn-out lawsuit: gather evidence, build a narrative, identify accomplices, and craft a reputation kill that forces the opponent to choose between retreat and showing his face smeared. In Martin's eyes Nathan was not merely the man who slipped into a supposedly untouchable place, he was the mirror reflecting Martin's core weakness, his refusal to admit that those around him were not loved, they were managed. Thus the campaign against Nathan sought not only punishment. It doubled as Martin's proof to himself that every breach can be sealed, that anything slipping his grasp can be hauled back by exerting more force. He began with the flimsy network around Nathan, freelance contracts, eager promises not yet written, young collaborators easily swayed by a call from someone named Richardson. Martin didn't need dirty hands, he needed space in which rumor grows its own legs. A delayed payment here, a surprise partnership offered then cancelled last minute, a meeting rescheduled endlessly for technical reasons, threads knitting into an invisible net, forcing Nathan to disperse his focus, to choose between defending honor and chasing bread. A man eroded by petty frictions rarely retains the calm required to protect a woman walking a wire as thin as Samantha's. But if Martin is the sharpened blade, Samantha is the whetstone. She hurts, but she learns, and she turns pain into an equation for survival. Being put out does not make her tremble like an actress, it makes her clear-headed like someone who just cut free an anchor that felt safe but was dragging her under. She looked at the house one last time as at a scene that had drained all its colors, and in her chest she recognized an expensive truth: Martin's shelter had long been a luxury prison. She began listing what truly belonged to her and what was merely an extension of another's prestige. The first list was so short it choked her, the second ran as long as the minutes of a corporate takeover. The shock flayed away an old skin, forcing Samantha to admit that survival meant standing on muscles of her own, even if those muscles trembled under new weight. She realized that the only path that would not drag her back into Martin's orbit was to transform herself from tabloid fodder into a human rights case. In Fairmont Crest, the public craves a story of fairness to absolve their love of scandal, and Samantha, if she placed her language correctly, could make doors swing open again, not to return, but to pass through. The unborn child became a ruthless ruler against which to weigh every decision. Each phone call, each sheet of paper, each invitation landed on two scales: the mother's survival and the child's dignity. Samantha accepted that adult honor sometimes must be trimmed to shield a future life, but she refused to become a tool in any revenge. She would not allow Martin to reframe this as a morality fable for others, nor Nathan to hold it up as a certificate of love before skeptical committees. She chose the hardest way: to stand at the storm center, refusing to disappear, refusing theater, refusing to collaborate with anyone tugging her to their side with ropes braided from advantage. The only thing she carried was the stubborn work of rebuilding infrastructure: a hastily rented small apartment, an independent list of doctors, a bank account unattached to any prior authorization, a work schedule no longer routed through a manager in the Richardson orbit. As Samantha set each brick in her own structure, Martin drove the war to a deeper stratum where legal and moral levers swirl like wood grain. He mobilized people skilled at planting questions, pen names that write op-eds smelling of virtue but serving as steam valves for the frustrations of the advantaged. He invoked family standards like a seemingly flawless knife. The goal was not to drag Samantha back, it was to erect a ring of fire so that every bystander would think twice before extending a hand. Isolation is the most sophisticated weapon, and isolation always starts by making decent people fear getting dirty. A few calls to funders of programs Samantha was eyeing, a few friendly-sounding cautions that now is not the best time to take media risks, a few indefinitely postponed events for mysterious technical reasons, enough to form an invisible but solid glass wall. Martin believed the wall would bounce Samantha out, compelling her to concede before he even reached for a hammer. Nathan, at the opposite corner of the board, lived through a long night in which every decision had a chain reaction. He faced small stages where personal reputation sprouted question marks, flimsy contracts, professional relationships tilting like wine glasses on a wobbly table. He wanted to shout to a full room that the child is proof of love, not guilt, but he knew such declarations are chalked up as cheap rhetoric unless backed by proof of responsibility. And in Fairmont Crest, responsibility is rarely measured by feeling. He plunged into plans, hunted for steady work, tried to build a financial buffer big enough to say he could protect. But every advance snagged on invisible thread stretched from the house where Martin sat, and each snag stoked a raw anger without language, only the impulse to ram through. He learned to hold back, knowing a single unrestrained collision would be read as proof of an impulsive man, and that would kill his only chance to stand beside Samantha without making her ashamed of her choice. The storm reached eyewall strength when news of Samantha leaving spread like a cold draft through office corridors and dull lunches where people chew other lives to swallow their own futility. The talk named no names, yet everyone knew who was who. For that reason it wrecked more thoroughly than a public statement. Samantha moved quietly among doctor visits, necessary meetings for new work, and ordinary grocery runs, small tasks she had never done alone. Each small task was a lesson in owning her body and time, a confirmation that she was no longer an appendix, a long, steady breath on a track without applause. Martin sat in his study underlining entries to monitor, updating reports no one but he could see. In the middle of those lines a blank opened like a void in a freshly built wall. A question about whether power actually fixes what's broken, or merely recasts the shards into more attractive material to hide them. The question irritated him. He wasn't here to philosophize, he was here to win. Yet a tiny knock inside his head reminded him that some victories turn the house into a lordless fortress, where the victor has no one left to speak to but his own echo. One afternoon the rain came down as if the sky had lost its patience, and Samantha realized she no longer feared getting wet. She crossed a slick pavement, a bag swinging with the rhythm of a reconstruction that needs no fireworks. She knew the road ahead bristled with traps, that Martin would keep extending the glass wall, that Nathan still had to learn how to shelter rather than bare his chest, that the child would be an exam all the adults must sit in silence. But she also knew there are things that only appear when one steps out from the overhang, self-respect without someone else's cologne, a night's sleep unbroken by the nightmare of surprise meetings, a morning when her shadow is not eclipsed by another power's silhouette. She promised herself she would not become anyone's instrument, not even her anger's. She would use anger like a kitchen knife, not to stab but to pare away the excess and prepare a meal that could feed two on real strength. Martin closed his day flipping through news channels like a code sheet, scanning for points to press. He saw unrelated tidbits cohere into a shape, a hunch that the field was shifting, that Samantha was not collapsing as predicted, that a stubborn energy was rising from the cracks he thought he had sealed. He refused to credit the feeling. He added 2 appointments to the calendar, one with a lawyer, one with the media team. He believed no machine exists that cannot increase output if its operator pays the price. But as the study's darkness thickened and the only sound was the tiny hand of the clock, he remembered a neglected detail, the calm of not counting. And he understood, though he would not admit it, that counting itself had made him miss the first moment when he should have looked Samantha in the eyes to see what was actually happening, before everything turned into a campaign, a plan, a battle. Night fell on Fairmont Crest like a theater curtain lowering in slow motion, concealing hands groping for switches. In 3 different rooms, 3 adults forced themselves into new shapes to fit the costumes fate tossed at them. Martin tried to force anger into order, Samantha forged anger into discipline, Nathan kept anger sheathed, denying it the explosion that would crack everything he hoped to protect. The betrayal had happened, the banishment had taken place, the punishment was underway. And yet among those heavy words, something no one expected opened its eyes. The will to live of a woman driven to a wall who refused to melt into it, and the unease of a powerful man seeing the first hairline split in a shield he had burnished for years. The story will stretch on, more invisible trials, more moments when all 3 must swallow what they hurled. But now, under a misting rain over big roofs, there is a tiny sound like clean metal touching, the moment an old map is folded and a new one drawn, not with the symbols of power, but with fine lines of persistence. In that quiet, the consequences of every betrayal and every punishment continue to flow, but another current begins as well, slow and certain, running toward autonomous choices, toward boundaries drawn by a trembling but straight hand, toward a future standing not on fear, but on accountability to oneself and to a life that has never done wrong.